I am unashamed. What about you?
Well, welcome back to Unashamed. I have relocated. I'm kind of like Johnny Cash, Dad. I've been everywhere, man.
I never did listen to Johnny too much.
Oh, Johnny Cash is good.
No,
I like it.
One of the best.
Well, I listened to Ring of Fire 1,000 times because our little one, that song resonated, but he's moved on now. We're staying alive now.
Well,
Bee Gees.
Well, I made a duck hole this year, maybe to his credit then, because I named it the Ring of Fire.
Really?
Yeah, not from the Johnny Cash song, from Firepower in the Bushes, and a new duck hole in another part of the woods.
And I like that name for a duck hole. That is a good name, the Ring of Fire.
The Ring of Fire, that's what we call it.
I'm in on that. I didn't. Well, why did
all woods.
Why was I not a part of the name calling session?
Well,
or the naming.
You just were the ones that you were the head man going in to purchase this property. It was a former hunting club. We now own it.
Well, let's just make a rule. If money goes from my wallet to your hand to whoever owns the land, I should automatically have a seat at the naming ceremony.
There's just three at the table, Willie,
What's going on here?
Willie, you, and me. But it's it. And I said, boys, just put it in your name. I'll pay the third of the property.
I know.
Pay the third.
Phil, I get that part. I just want a name. I mean, that's a great name.
Yeah.
The Ring of Fire.
Ring of Fire.
So they didn't need you, Jace. They came up with that name without you. You need to be out of all names.
We had to have some kind of wordage to
you might
say,
have
let's go
thought it.
over there. Yeah, let's go over there. We'll hunt the Ring of Fire this morning. Everybody looks around like, whoa, what's that? But you'll know.
I think it's a bold move to name a place the Ring of Fire and it's never been hunted. I mean, that's a pretty bold. You're just hoping it's a Ring of Fire.
I put my 50 years of chasing ducks into action. And so we bought the property, and the food regime is great. There's all kind of vegetation out there now. Big overcup acorn trees spaced out, willow oaks. And you look down through there, it'll literally take your breath. You're like, wow.
So if the ducks doesn't come in to this spot, then you'll have to change it from the Ring of Fire to the Ring of Reflection.
The Ring of Misery.
Ring of Reflection.
The Ring of Misery.
What about the Ring of Dry Fire?
Great looking duck blind,
There we go.
great looking spot, but no ducks.
No, Al's got it. We'll change it to the Ring of Dry Fire.
Yeah.
The Ring of Dry Fire.
We don't know how good the hole is until we get, I've arranged it where now we can flood it, which we never had that capability, so I can flood it. The gates are down, they're shut, and I can put about this much water, all we need, 4 to 12 inches. And when that gets there, we will observe, sneak around and observe. And when you start seeing ducks pile in there, you say, the Ring of Fire is taking on new meaning.
Ring of Fire. Well, I'll tell you, if that happens, I'm going to get out my device that you detest. And because I can do that, I can take my phone out and pull up that Johnny Cash song while we're in the woods.
You got to remember, this is a computer-free zone.
No, I'm doing it.
You know,
if we hammer the ducks there,
I didn't look at my computer and say, what shall I do with this real estate? I just looked around at 50 years of chasing ducks, and I said, here's what we're going to do right here.
It's one song. You got to have a walk-up song. Even baseball players, they have a walk-up song. So if this hole produces the first time we whack a bunch, you're going to be sitting there and we're talking about how they came in. And
this bunch is for Johnny Cash.
Then all of a sudden, you're going to hear this sound. Dun, 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 dun.
Dun, 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 dun. That's a good song.
It is.
Everybody needs a theme song. Everybody needs a theme song.
Right now, we're still on the Bee Gees with our little one that's staying with us. Because he's in that screaming stage, but he's not crying. He realized that a voice can project.
You have to train dogs not to do that, as you well know.
Yeah, but I like kids that do it. It's a sign they're alive and happy. He'll just...
By the way, Jace, I saw a picture in my bedroom, and the picture was you had written a note with a heart Halloween, not a Halloween, or what do you call it? Valentine's Day. I looked at it, and you caught a shot of old Blue. That lab, he's still alive, but he's old. But you had a shot of him licking the side of your face, big old tongue, just. And you had.
I didn't. If I was in the picture, that means I didn't take it.
That's right.
Somebody else took it. And what happened, because me and that dog didn't like each other.
Yeah.
But then at some point, he started liking me.
Yep.
And so maybe that was, somebody caught that. That sounds like
He peed on your bag every time he got the
No,
chance.
that's Si. He peed on Si's bag.
But he peed on Si's every time. He didn't like Si. He peed on his hunting boot. I mean, his shell bag.
He actually peed on Si.
He peed on him.
Yeah.
He would circle around him from the back end.
Catch him not looking.
And Si would say, "Good grief, what are you scoundrel?" So I think I remember that picture. Dane Burley Jennings took that. And,
is that right? Burl said he'll be
he
here.
asked me to sign it, and they gave it. I think he gave that to you as a present.
He's bringing 2 of Blue's offspring with him. So we're going to see if we can get another Blue.
Well, that's
without
exciting.
the whining.
Yeah, that's exciting. If that dog whines, I'm out.
So it's exciting times.
No, it's exciting. The fall is my favorite time of year. You got football. You got hunting season, obviously, and just the weather's overall better. But look, so I'm gonna pull a stunt tonight. So because we're getting off into October here, and usually, you have to say goodbye to one of my favorite times of the year, which is frog hunting. But I'm actually going frog hunting tonight, and here's why. I'm going with a buddy of mine. So I let my dog out last night, middle of the night. Probably midnight, I guess. And it's cool last night.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a spotlight, and I thought, I'm going to ease down this pond because it's warm during the day, but it's nice. Very low humidity. I mean, this is not normal weather for here. It's awesome. But I said, I wonder if the frogs are still out because it's really warm during the day.
You had already asked me that, and what did I say?
You said, I think they are. Well, guess what? You were right. So I start panning the pond around. And there's a big pine tree that fell during the last storm across the pond. And one of the limbs, I looked on the edge of it, and it was the biggest bullfrog you've ever seen in your life.
You got to take him out, Jason.
No, I'm going to leave him, but I'm going to go to, I've got access to the greatest frog catching place in North Louisiana. A buddy of mine owns it. And so I sent him a text, and I told him the story, and he said, come on. So we're going to transition into the hunting with guns, ducks, deer, squirrels. We're going to go from the frogs hunting with your hand. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do one last hurrah tonight. So I'll give you a report a couple podcasts from now on how that went.
I'd rather get a report about when you're going to be cooking those. I might need to stop by and visit the baby.
Well, see,
he wants the meal. Is not worried about the feed.
Yeah, wait. Yeah, hold off until the, November 14th because your cousin's coming in town. You can invite me over.
Well, the list is long and of people who want that information, but you got to remember there's some things in life that are classified. Information, invitation only. So I'll let you know, maybe, if you're on the list.
So in other words, Zach, don't be waiting by the phone. It's not going to happen.
It reminds me, Al, when we went to the inauguration, and we got invited to a party that wasn't a party. And there was a list that was actually no list. And I had the strangest conversation, a 20-minute conversation in a hotel lobby with a group of individuals who we were discussing our family being invited to the inauguration party that didn't exist.
Who was being inaugurated?
Trump.
Donald J. Trump.
Huh.
Yeah. And so I said, Willie, it was Willie and Corey and think it was just me and Missy and Willie and Corey.
Yep.
And so I said,
wasn't on the list. Zach and I were on the list.
Where do we go? Where's this party? I think that's what I asked, because they had a liaison from the new presidential team or whatever. And they said, well, that it doesn't exist. And I said, well, if it doesn't exist, it's like every question I would ask, they would answer it with a question. And so finally I was like, are you kidding? Are you serious? And they're like, no, show up at this hotel at 2:00 in the morning. And you'll be told where to go from there. The party started at 2:00 and we went. And so we got there, and surprisingly, there was a few hundred people that I guess there was no list. There was no place designated. You just walked on the side of the
pecking order.
No, and you finally you found yourself there after you went through a lot of security.
It sounds like a rave.
Yeah, it was actually interesting.
Sure.
So it was us four, and I had a bodyguard actually at that time. So that's an interesting thing that happened in my life that I will never forget. So there's no record of it. Right. Don't you find that interesting?
It's interesting.
Yeah, but I think it was mainly because they didn't want a ton of people there. And so the Trump family came out, I think.
And they didn't want to offend people.
You didn't want to offend anybody.
Hey, what happened?
Yeah, they brought that up because if you didn't get invited, but we got invited, so it was cool.
Well, if it was 2 a.m, I'm glad I didn't get invited. Oof. I don't know how'd you stay awake? Of course, you're a night person anyway.
Oh, I'm a night person. Yeah.
Yeah. You're like Mom. Mom's like that. Does she still stay up late at night, Dad? Like she always used to?
Every night. 12, 1 o'clock.
That's where I get it. But unlike Miss Kay, I go to bed late and get up early.
Yeah. She goes to bed late and gets up late.
But I take a nap during the day. So sometimes it's only 20 minutes, but I savor that 20 minutes.
All I've found out in my 76 years on the earth, Jase, and you'll find this out as the time passes, that when God made a woman, he made a very strange creature.
Boy, the insights this morning are...
You're going to find that out. I'm just giving you a heads up before it gets there. Don't forget that one.
I'll remember that. Thank you, Phil.
Another misogyny moment for Phil. So let's take a break. So we know we got some pretty wacky people out there on the far left, and you just never quite know what's going to happen with them. I know that Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative mobile phone provider, and they're a force for conservative values, which is very different than the other big cell phone providers. So this is a chance to go with a company and go with a group that funds conservative causes and candidates who believe in sanctity of life, freedom of speech, the Second Amendment. And these are all issues that we've been winning, but you can't do that unless you got people that support it. And we need people in the corporate world that do that. Patriot Mobile has affordable plans for you and your family, even your business. They offer the same nationwide coverage as the major carriers because they use multiple major networks. Plus, you're supporting conservative values with every call. So check them out at patriotmobile.com/Phil, or you can call them at 972-PATRIOT. You're going to get free activation with the offer code Phil. And remember, there's special discounts for veterans and first responders. patriotmobile.com/Phil, or call them at 972-PATRIOT.
You get them figured out, then you get back in touch with me. But that's my deal.
I think that was God.
Strange creatures, not bad. It's not negative. They just strange creatures, women.
Yeah. It might be that you just
They're definitely different.
You may have an issue that, I look around and it's kind of like that guy I was talking to. He'd been married like 7 times, and I was like, Have you ever considered that it might be you? Because he had a similar view towards women, and he's like, he was looking around like
it's within the realm of possibility.
Because they could be normal, and you could be strange.
And I'm the most normal person, so normal that I seem abnormal when you meet me.
Yeah, I think this has been a great intervention and counseling session.
My dad always tells that story. He says, Phil, they were standing somewhere, and Phil said, Dash talked about my dad. You are one odd-looking dude. and my dad's line always, so we're walking in an airport, and people look at me, and they look at you, and I'm the one they look at and say, that's an odd-looking dude.
Exactly.
He'll say, yeah, they got to look about him.
Hey, Dash got to look about him.
Yeah. Well, we're in the book of Mark, as you know. We've been studying it, and I think on the last podcast, Jase, we talked about the healing of the wild man in the tombs, the guy that was living in the graveyard, and it really was I don't know. In my notes, I entitled it "The Restoration of a Human Wreck," because we talked about this before. This guy, he had so many demons living in him. I mean, he had no chance for any kind of life. I mean, he was isolated. He was crazy. He was crazy in his mind, but he was also cutting himself with rocks and stones. They tried to bind him down. They couldn't do it. And I've thought about it before, because what we're going to get into today is a couple of like really strong faith situations, people coming to Jesus for healing. But I didn't really realize it till I was looking ahead. When you look back, this guy, he shows no faith because he was possessed by demons. I mean, he's just out there living like a wild man. And yet Jesus went to him. Jesus saw him in this situation and decided to cast these demons out. So it was kind of funny because we've been talking to us about miracles and how level of faith, and people say, well, they didn't have enough faith. And if you had more faith, then you would be able to see or accept this miracle or whatever. But this guy had zero faith. He was almost a bystander to the situation because he was possessed by all these demons.
While you're there,
and yet he was restored.
While you're there, when Peter was telling the story in the book of Acts after Jesus died, was buried, and raised from the dead, and he went back into heaven, God anointed Jesus of Nazareth. Now listen to this, with the Holy Spirit. This ought to tickle Jase a little bit. And how he went around doing good, all these miracles and things, and telling all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We're witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him from the dead on the third day and caused him to be seen. Now listen to this. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And he commanded us to preach to the people and testify. But how do you wrap your head around the fact that all this was almost like what he was going to do was prearranged from the beginning of time, these texts say. But he said, but not everybody got to look at him even, but it was the ones who were closest to him. How does that square with Mark chapter 3, chapter 4? All these events that are happening. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead.
Yeah, that's my point is, even that kind of, you're right, Dad, that ties in with this person, because Jesus chose him to display the miraculous power of God. It's like the guy in John 9. He's just sitting there, he's blind, and the disciples looked over at him and they were like, who sinned that this man would be born blind? We can't figure, was it him? Was it his parents? He said it was neither. This man was born blind so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And then he went over and made the little mud packs and put it on his eyes, and he healed him. But the guy never asked to be healed. I mean, God chose him See what I'm saying? So I think that's, I don't know if that's exactly answer your question, but I think people are chosen by the Almighty to display greatness in who he is. And this man that had the demon cast out, remember, he was going around first to his family, but then he went around to 10 cities and really, in essence, became the first missionary, because this was even before the disciples were sent out. This guy was sent out just to display what had been done in his life. So it's almost like some are chosen specifically for that purpose.
This is like
does that make sense?
Pre-health care and pre-hospitals, a lot of misery going on, but this was before healing was just, you were lucky if you ran up on Jesus. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there was not a whole lot of medicine and a lot of misery at this time frame.
Well, there definitely would have been way more of this kind of stuff going, and not just the demon possession, but you're right, Dan, way more maladies and illnesses, and because you're right. I mean, people. I wonder what the life expectancy was in the first century. It was probably 40 years old.
Yeah,
you didn't live long.
Yeah,
or less. That's exactly right. So, yeah, which again may have been back to something Jay said in the last podcast. The timing of when Jesus came mattered so much.
Jesus trumped.
He came at a time.
Yeah, he ended up trumping all that is involved in health care. I mean, he was the ultimate healer, bar none. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And also, and he said that he came to display God. So to show his power, he didn't necessarily come just to stamp out all disease. We know that, or to stamp out poverty, because people say, well, that he said the poor you'll always have with you. It's not like he was pro poverty, but I mean that wasn't his purpose.
Just the way it is.
To come to display eternal life, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, all of his healings and all the acts that Jesus is doing here. I think if you get off on the actual miracle, and that's what you're primarily focused on, you're missing that these miracles are reflections of his greater glory. These are reflections of him and his presence and his immanence, and that he's here, he's with us, he's active, he cares. You see the attributes of God. That's what Paul says in Romans 1 too. These attributes of God, his divine qualities, his divine nature, and these are things that have been clearly perceived by what's been made. Well, this is even like a further, more specific version of God's revelation. I mean, it's very specific. I mean, he's doing things here, and I love this story of the casting out of the demons, because this came right off the back of him exerting tremendous authority when he commands the winds and the waves to stop. Like that's an act of authority, which is one of God's attributes, his sovereignty. And so here he's again, even God in flesh is exercising his divine sovereignty and authority when he's now showing that he has authority not just over the winds and the waves, he has authority over the spiritual realm as well, that he can command demons to get out and they leave.
He appointed him, Jesus, as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him. This is in Acts chapter 10. All the prophets testified about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. I mean, the big picture was their sins were being forgiven as they were being healed, which you just want to say, wow.
Yeah, because the name of Jesus is when we even like that. When Jesus said, "Anything you ask in my name, you'll receive." I mean, he's not talking about like a Mercedes Benz. He says, "Anything you ask in my name," and to unpack what that means to ask something in the name of Jesus, it's not simply just to tag his name on to end to something that you want. It's you're asking for something that's within his authority, dominion, sovereign will for your life. And so I think there's a big, big picture unfolding here in the Gospel of Mark that's different than some of the others, because the emphasis here is on Jesus, as Jase has pointed out at the beginning of this series. It's an emphasis on that Jesus is the Son of God with a capital G. He is the Son of God. He is
life and immortality came with him, which you talk about everything at stake. All these stories, you say life and immortality is on the line here, and he conquered both. You just look at it, and you're like,
well, when he said the time,
with him.
And look, don't negate the fact too. He said the time has come, and I mean, he's laying out a process. Because I'm a big process guy, you know, whether it's football or any kind of adventure, you have to love the process and not, you know, focus on the results here. Because I mean, you know, when we get to the next chapter, things are not going to go real well here. I mean, your main two voices, Jesus, who's doing all these miracles, and John the Baptist, who prepared the way. Well, Jesus is, he's mocked in his hometown.
He's laying out,
and
I'm indestructible, and I'm going to prove it.
Well, he is, but the people, he's having to go through a process because people are not embracing this. I mean, sure, the people being healed are, and the people that are being redeemed
they're
from the
still saying,
but they're just coming for more cures and not necessarily a transformation of a spiritual character.
That's it.
You know, adjustment. That's why when he starts off with saying, repent, for the kingdom is near. Well, people, they're like, well, just heal me and forget the repentance.
Yeah.
Hang on, Jace. Hey, hang on, let's take a break. All right, go ahead.
So when you know, I'm going to push back a little bit because I think he did have some faith in that when he got out of the boat, when Jesus got out of the boat, this guy comes to meet him. And I do think Jesus knew what was in a man. Now, whatever that means as far as him being the Son of God and him being the Son of Man and him becoming a man, but there's several times where it would say he knew what they were thinking.
Oh, he was a mind reader.
Well, so I'm saying when y'all talk about, I mean, I think a lot of this was a process that God set forth in a plan. So you have that going because he's like, don't tell everybody. Of course, one, we know he was concealing that from the rulers and the authorities so that they would eventually crucify Jesus and ultimately would be their demise and his victory. But also, it was just hard for human beings to wrap their minds around God in a human form, actually, and this being true. That's why, look, when we get to Mark chapter 6, I mean, there's been more sermons over that first paragraph because it's people who were familiar with Jesus. They were so familiar, they didn't believe. You know, he goes back to his hometown. They've already said he's crazy. He goes back
Which
there.
is it? Is it hard to believe? Is it hard to believe in him, Jesus, or easy to believe in him? That would be the question.
I think
it didn't seem to be.
I think it
come easy.
Well, it depends on your situation, I guess. It was a little easier for a guy who's chained up to a tombstone and is ravaged with demons. I think it was a little easier because I think the lower you are,
that's my
which
question.
is why God allows, you know, hurricanes and allows misery to happen on earth is because really you're reminded in these valleys, these wilderness, difficult moments, the need for a God. So, which is why
that's a good point too, because in the past we didn't have, you know, if you think about, 150 years ago, you didn't have the advancement of modern science to hide behind, and so people were much more reliant on God because, like, they were literally, if a storm came and the crop was ruined, they may not eat for the winter. And so, but now we're hiding behind our technological advances, and we're under the illusion, and it is an illusion that somehow we're going to, ultimately tame this thing. But ultimately, we're not. Even these people, every single person that Jesus healed, in the end, guess what happened to them? They died. They're not here anymore.
I told your dad the other day we were putting a book together, and I said my view of it is the only place you're ever going to be where there are no more hurricanes and no more fires and no more death when no more misery, is heaven itself. Heaven is the goal, and that's when it finally ends. The misery.
Yeah, it's in. Well, but I think. But I would say that.
Well, I just want to push back real quick. I think no more death, sure. No more misery, sure. But actually hurricanes and fire would not be a problem if we were imperishable. You know what I mean?
Which is my point.
Well, I know. I'm saying you could have a hurricane in heaven if you were imperishable. Because I actually would like to ride in the middle of one of those post-resurrection.
It'd be a perfect time to surf. You might get into surfing if you were imperishable.
I actually have a plan for a hurricane experience. I'm just going to wait till I get my imperishable.
But you agree, misery leaves when you get the invincibility. You're in Jesus.
I agree with those two. I'm not going to be miserable. Because, a lot of people say, this hurricane's evil. And it's like, no, it's the problem with a hurricane is that we're perishable.
Yeah.
But you have to have fire because we got to fry fish. And
exactly.
Jesus
fire
ate the fish,
is good for a lot of things. And storms actually help if you never had a front, we never would shoot any ducks because it actually moves the ducks. But go ahead, Zach.
No, I think this matters because when you think about what Jesus is doing through these incredible happenings here, and there's a lot of them in the Gospel of Mark and all the Gospels for that matter, he's not establishing his authority here simply to invoke this, we've said this over and over again, this political kingdom, power kingdom, is actually he's establishing his credibility in his authority through these miracles so that he would then walk in humility the hill of Calvary. So I mean that's the craziness of this whole thing, that you have this divine authority, like this guy, the same guy that's literally telling the wind and the waves to stop, the same guy that's putting mud on people's eyes and they can see, the same guy that says pick up your mat and walk, the same guy that could go up to a demon possessed man and say get out of this man, and they send him into pigs, and the pigs run it.
Presenting, he didn't get there like what he was dealing with. He's not a priest, not on the basis of a regulation. Other priests got together, human beings, as to his ancestry, but he got to where he is on the basis, and Mark's covering it, the basis of the power of an indestructible life. That's how he got where he is.
Yeah, it's Hebrews.
No more high priest needed. Said, no, just one time event here. God himself is our high priest.
Yeah, so when you get the picture, there's a song we sang Sunday at church called Behold Our God, and it's like, who sits upon his throne, come let us adore him and work. And it's got this picture of God's bigness.
Yeah.
And it asks these questions like, who else, I can't remember all the words, but who else spoke the world into existence? Who caused the season?
It's really hard for a human being to wrap his head around that, Zach. If you
you can't wrap your head around it, but you can I always say you can touch the hem of his garment, right? You can just kind of touch the peripheral of it, but you can never exhaust this bigness of who he is. But then I love this song because the last verse is, who else had the nails in their hand? So we're talking about this God who is big, authority, sovereignty, just think about power, indestructible, all of those adjectives. Just throw everyone, marvelous, majestic, omniscient, omnipotent, just anything big, just throw in the mix.
Yeah.
And then think that God walked in humility on a road with a cross on his back and let the people that he spoke into existence spit on him, whip him. He heads up to the hill, and he ultimately let us kill him. And you say, "Whoa!" You can't understand. You can only understand the depth of God's love if you understand the height of His sovereignty and His bigness. You can only understand the power of the cross to the extent that you can see the bigness of God, because there's a distance that He traveled to do that.
Yep.
So I think we're seeing morsels of that in the beginning of the Gospel of Mark.
Yep.
It's an establishment of authority of Christ so that we can see at the end that he's going to walk a road of suffering and humility.
Well, it is an honor to read these texts.
Hang on, Dad. Let's take a break.
I consider it an honor.
Today.
I consider it an honor to even just read about it. What do you say, Al?
Absolutely. And Jase made the point, I think that was really good, and Zach made it too, that I think this is the biggest difference in in humanism versus God, because you're called a climate denier if you're not running around with your head on fire, worried about the atmosphere, the planet, the storm, the intensity of the storms. And I'm saying, no, I'm really not a climate denier. I mean, I totally affirm we have a climate and it changes, but I'm a God affirmer. That's what I am. And so the storms were here before we got here. And so before human beings, so the difference is these people, and Zach, you're right, it's a false narrative. They think they're in charge. And so because of us, we've intensified the storms, and we can fix them, and we can make them where they're not as intense. You talk about a dog chasing his tail, you're going to run around in circles a long time trying to fix the planet that God made.
Which is what was happening here with this demon-possessed man. I was reading this verse 15, Phil, and I thought about in Mark 5, and it says verse 14, the herdsman ran away and reported in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. You know, what had happened was, and this is what happened. They came to Jesus, and they observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. I was thinking about that story that you told before where you were in the rehab with the woman, and do you remember the story where, I can't remember exactly what happened, but
he told that in the last overtime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so where she's gargling meat, and you said it sounded like she was gargling meat, and she's out of her mind, and she's cussing at you. And it reminds me of this guy. And then when you said to her something to the effect of that she was under the control of the devil and that she didn't know Jesus, I forgot the whole story because I wasn't in the overtime segment on the last one, but like she came back in after that, and
she slammed her head on the table in front of her like this, down, and projectile vomiting took place. She runs away. 15 minutes, she walks back in, and she went from cursing us and cursing God, and she just had in a little meek voice, she said, "Can y'all help me?" And I said, "We can help you, girl."
I took the approach, since you weren't in overtime, that maybe she was just drunk. That was all. So all she needed was Jesus and a good vomit.
No, she was in the rehab.
She was in the rehab.
She was in a rehab, like she had been in a full detox facility for some time.
Just because these people are in rehab doesn't mean they're not using anymore.
Yeah. This was beyond drunk. This was, if you'd seen it, it was beyond drunk. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm not denying it, but to me, it's not the issue that. I mean, the issue is Jesus has the authority and power of that. The demons, they all know who Jesus is. It is linked to the sinful world, the evil world, but we're all sinners, you know. Yeah. And I think they manifest.
The following day, when I baptized her, and I mentioned her, I said, "Who's going to be the Lord of your life from this point on?" And she confessed Jesus as Lord, but she was the most meek, gentle, caring little woman. She's probably 20 years old, but she went from a hellacious.
Well, that's my point. I mean, that she's a kind of a visceral example and of a person and what it looks like to be under the control.
I tell you that.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus brings rest, right? He brings, like, we've all, I mean, our own lives. I mean, think about where you were when we were under the control of the evil one. It is a restlessness. It's a aimless beating at the wind. And what God brings in his sovereignty and in his healing and in his authority and in his humility, what he brings context, he brings healing, he brings touch, he brings intimacy, rest, peace of mind.
Yep.
I think I've seen this over and over again, not only in my own life, but others' lives. So I think it speaks to what God's ultimate purpose here is. It's not just to go around and perform miracles for the sake of performing miracles. He has a grand picture in mind. He has an overarching goal that he's working towards here that we'll see accomplished at the cross and ultimately the resurrection.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. There's a plan here, and there was some timing involved because, when he goes to his hometown in Mark 3, his family says he's crazy. The leaders say he has a demon. But he goes back there 3 chapters later, and of course they're still not having it. But when you fast forward and look at the end, like at Acts 1:14, well, his family, they were gathered around in prayer post-resurrection, and most of them gave their life, for Jesus eventually.
He
think
won
about
them
James.
over.
Well, right. There was a process that had to happen. He's planting seeds because most people, if you go to a town and they say, your close people say, you're crazy, and the others say, you have an evil spirit, most of us are not going back to that town. We're done with that. And so I was bringing this up about the timing and the way God uses people who put their faith and trust in him. We always are looking just at the conversion. But to me, the most powerful passage is 18 and 19 of this story, which is going to lead to these next 2 stories. When he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. I mean, look, this goes against everything most religious people are going to say. They're like, well, come on, pick him up. What a story that this guy's going to be a great leader. And Jesus says, no, you go back to your house, because in God's plan, in God's world, he's going to use people who have been transformed by him and by his power to help other people. And so he's got a job for him. And guess where it is, which I think it should be all of our first mission field, is back to his house. And so he goes back there. I mean,
Go tell your wife and children.
This is encouraging to me, because I'm like, everybody's plan is not the same. Everybody's conversion is not the same. Sure, we all are drawn by Jesus. That is the same. We all get the power of the Holy Spirit. That is the same. But some people are not going to vomit. Some people are not going to have a big testimony. Some people are just not even going to be mentioned, and then all of a sudden they're in a room praying with the other followers a couple books later. Well, something happened, but it's not recorded. We don't, and I think you see that when you get to Mark 6. I keep bringing this up because a lot of people were so familiar with Jesus that they didn't recognize him as the Son of God. Well, that really hits home in churches. Kids that are raised in church fail to be wowed by Jesus because they've heard it the whole time. They're like, oh, yeah, I know that.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, why is your life not showing that you know that? Because it's not. But the familiarity with it is actually the blocker. It's not an evil spirit. It's not. So, I mean, the evil one works in different ways, but so does God. So I wanted to at least introduce the next 2 stories. Can we do that, Al?
Hang on. Yeah, before we do that, let's take our last break.
So then, if you were going to have a movie, Zach, you're in the movie making business. Here's the next. This is a movie. This next happening, because when you look at it and you realize that we're all in different places in life and in different generations through time, but we all, from God's providence and his draw through Jesus, we come together at the feet of Jesus on a cross from various backgrounds.
Yep.
Decision. And here, so he just picks two people, but notice the similarities. So when Jesus, this is verse 21 of chapter 5, had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, large crowd is here. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come, put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. But so now we have a story within a story, because I mean, this guy is panicking. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. So now we have another story, and it's in the context of this Jairus saying, come on, hurry. But you can imagine the frustration there if your daughter is dying, your 12-year-old daughter is dying, and you think you have the cure, but we can't. Traffic but this is the equivalent of 5 o'clock traffic, but it's people, since they didn't have vehicles. And so this woman in 26, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had trying to get better, because you brought that up about, the hospital system wasn't what it is now. Yet instead of getting better, she actually grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, the bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around into the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" You see the people crowding against you, his disciple answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? So, I mean, there was a lot of people. It was just crammed. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Now, I think he knew who did it. We're making the moment here. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Another translation said her whole story, which the reason I bring that up, because Jairus is like, I mean, can you imagine a woman telling her whole story? I mean, it's like,
imagine Miss K.
Yeah. Imagine Miss K telling you her whole story, her whole life story, while Jairus is over here saying, what about my daughter? So he's frustrated. He's not participating in this joy because he's frustrated. So while Jesus was speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus. The synagogue ruler said, "Your daughter is dead." Oh, hang on. I skipped a part. So when in 34 it says, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came to the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Now, can you imagine Jairus now? So ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, which is kind of interesting. When they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "While this commotion and wailing, this child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him, which is really interesting. I mean, if you can change your wailing to laughing that quickly, you probably wasn't being very sincere, in my opinion. After he put them all out, so there's a sermon in here, because he said, "Get out." And, of course, then he's going to say, "Get up." Al, you writing this down? He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, I'll let someone else pronounce that, which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was, 12 years old. At this, they were astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Now, the reason I said this is a lot of life is about intersections and God's timing and God using other people to bring Jesus. Because look, you now back to your movie making, Zach. We have a hospital scene and we have a woman walking out who had just been diagnosed with some weird blood disease. Of course, it was a bad diagnosis because she got worse. Meanwhile, here comes a couple out of the hospital who just had a baby, because the girl was 12 years old. This woman had this issue for 12 years. Do you think that's an accident that he's telling this story at the same time? So two people, at one time, they're coming out of the hospital with two totally different attitudes. But now here they come together in life in one day, coming together at Jesus's feet with different issues, but you have the same thing happening. And I do believe the number 12, which has been a symbol throughout the whole Bible, of completeness and whole or whatever, has something to do with it too. But I mean, this is an amazing two stories. So what say you?
I say we're out of time, but that's the perfect build-up to tease our overtime segment to talk some more about this, because I was taking some notes, Jase, as you were reading that story, because there's a lot of really interesting things. So we're going to dive a little more into that on the other side, blazetv.com/unashamed. If you want to follow us over for an extra 15 minutes of conversation about this story and other musings, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.